I am Tirza Latimer, and I'm chair of the Visual and Critical Studies program here at CCA, as many of you know. And I welcome you, and we welcome you to this graduate lectures series talk by Donna Haraway, which we are so proud to host. And we invite you, as many of you who gosh, if you all show up, we're going to be in trouble. But tomorrow, also in the boardroom, Professor Haraway is agreed to participate in a VCS forum. As you are aware, we do open those to the public and encourage you to attend this one tomorrow or any of the others we have planned for the rest of the semester and year, and just check our website for information about those events. We aim to be and hope that we succeed in being, to the extent that it's possible, the hub of interdisciplinary encounter here at CCA. And so it's a very great privilege to have a scholar among us addressing us tonight who personifies, I think, the spirit and the act of interdisciplinarity, and also to see so many people from so many different programs and departments at the college. Donna Haraway earned a degree in zoology and philosophy at Colorado College, and she's also agreed not to make faces if I say anything that's untrue, but she can graciously correct me if I err. She lived in Paris for a year, for those of Francophiles among us, studying philosophies of evolution on a Fulbright scholarship before earning her PhD in biology at Yale University. Her dissertation predicted an innovative career. It explored the functions of metaphor in shaping research in 20th century developmental biology. In September 2000, she was awarded the highest honor given by the Society for Social Studies of Science, the J.D. Bernal Award, for lifetime contributions to the field. She's recognized across the spectrum of academic disciplines as a leading thinker about people's relationships with machines and animals, and the reverse. Her ideas have sparked debates in the fields of sociology, primatology, philosophy, feminist studies, media and communication studies, anthropology, and developmental biology. For going on 3 decades, Professor Haraway has contributed to the creation and evolution of the History of Consciousness graduate program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her books include Crystals, Fabrics, and Fields, Metaphors of Organicism in 20th Century Developmental Biology, Primate Visions, Gender, Race, and Nature in the World of Modern Science, Simians, Cyborgs, and Women, The Reinvention of Nature, Modest Witness at Second Millennium, Female Man, Copyright Meets, Onco Mouse, Trademark, Feminism and Technoscience. I think I left out a couple of signs there. The Companion Species Manifesto, Dogs, People, and Significant Otherness in 2003, and most recently, When Species Meet, 2008. The title of her talk this evening is Staying with the Trouble, Becoming with Creatures of Empire. Please join me in welcoming Donna Haraway.
Thanks a lot. I've long been of the opinion that the only people who should be able to hear introductions are one's parents. They're highly shaming and very nice. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And you could go ahead and put the slides up on the screen from the get-go. We should have the first slide. I guess I'll pull this down since I think I'm working it from here. Hey, it works. Okay. The title of this talk, as Teresa said, is Staying with the Trouble or Becoming with Creatures of Empire. An alternative title was Companion Species for Altermondialisation, in a kind of alliance with the European, not so much anti-globalization activists, as activists for a vision of living on the earth, in the mud, an altermondialisation of a multi-species, multi-class, polyvocal political kind that could have some kind of vision for a justice and a time to come that could be inhabitable. Now, we live in North America. We live on the west coast of North America. We live in conquest territory, whose ecologies of both people and organisms and technologies have been permanently altered by what Virginia Anderson, looking at the processes from the point of view of the East Coast, called creatures of empire. Ever since the important book Green Imperialism, I think people have gotten used to understanding that the apparatuses of colonialization, the apparatuses of the instantiation of empire, are overwhelmingly composed of other species, that the pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, microorganisms, disease organisms, plants, that the critters of empire are crucial mechanisms of changing the conditions of possibility for who can live on the land how. Who will live and who will die is very much writ in the track of the pigs in Virginia, in New England. The difference between the deer and the pigs in terms of regimes of property is absolutely fundamental to the confrontation of the East Coast colonists and the Iroquois nations. That's become a somewhat familiar story within the context of Virginia Anderson's marvelous book, Creatures of Empire. But I grew up in Colorado, in the northern Rockies, on the high plains, dreaming of being kidnapped by Native Americans and spirited out of my Catholic girls' school, preferably on horseback. I grew up with the kind of deep affect and fantasies of a white girl who is a child of colonists and doesn't know it. A white girl who is also the child of working class immigrants, growing up in the Queen City of the Plains, though I knew nothing about what real queens really were. Denver. Never mind. It's just San The Queen City of the Plains was a marvelous place to grow up. But the point is, I grew up in the territory that was shaped by the mining, by the ranching, by the what became the financial center of the Rocky Mountain Empire, the areas of coal shale mining, the areas of copper and silver and gold, commemorated, of course, in Agnes Smedley's amazing working class book of the earlier parts of the 20th century. I'm a girl of the West. I'm a girl who grew up inheriting the trouble of the turning of the western United States, the West Coast, the Rocky Mountain region, the Southwest, the Northwest, into conquest territory and its multiple palimpsestic layers of conquest, including the layers of waves of conquest by Native Americans. But beginning in my story with New Spain and the waves of conquest that come up from the southern movement of the Spanish Empire, and then becoming through the processes in California of the gold rush and then the post-Civil War consolidation of United States territory. It's the specific making of the West into the territory of the United States that is infusing the work that I'm trying to do under the label of staying with the trouble, staying with the layers of organisms, the layers of technologies, the layers of people, the cat's cradle players of the Western territories, in conversation with the histories of the other former white settler colonies and immigration, multiple globalizing, making worlds through many layers of immigration and settlement and displacement. It's that staying with the trouble that this lecture is about. Now, I want to begin with a kind of overheard conversation by some of my teachers, First, Marilyn Strathern, an anthropologist who spent much of her time studying with the people of Papua New Guinea, especially Highland Papua New Guinea. She says it matters which concepts we use to think other concepts with. I think of Marilyn Strathern as an ethnographer of cognitive practices, whereby what counts as the quieted, stabilizing, foundational concepts which are used to think other cognitive practices with is exactly what's in question in an ethnographic encounter. A non-primitivizing ethnographic encounter is precisely about the problem of getting it, that whole worlds of concepts undo other concepts in the meeting. Marilyn Strathern is my guide through this very interesting matter. Then Jacques Derrida says inheritance is never a given, it is always a task, it remains before us. And I started with a kind of evocation of the question of how to inherit, how to get it that the molecules of one's body are shaped by the history of sheep and cattle ranching in the northern Rockies, how to get it that the very chemical composition of one's flesh is an inheritance that somehow must be thought, and the concept and what concepts one uses to somehow learn to inherit is at stake in the task of staying with the trouble. But then Deborah Bird Rose and Tom Van Doorn, Australians who are currently putting together a book called Unloved Others, that begins with the image that's in front of you, Tracks for Unloved Others, ask, what, though, is the fate of those threatened others that are unregarded, unliked, or even actively vilified? What is it like, says Deborah Bird Rose, to write in a time of exterminations, of active exterminations and active killings? And what is it like to write in a time of extinctions without going apocalyptic? What is it like to be responsible in a time of unprecedented mass death of both industrial and non-industrial kinds? Now, Patricia Piccinini, an artist who has informed me in many contexts. Some of you probably know Patricia Piccinini's amazing installations, and her, I'm particularly in love with her creatures that are the protectors for so-called endangered species, these variously fabulated alien creatures with wonderful canine teeth that Piccinini fabulates to take care of the golden helmeted honey eater, and the northern hairy-nosed wombat, and other very fine critters. Piccinini says, I am particularly fascinated by the unexpected consequences of the stuff we don't want but must somehow accommodate. There is no question as to whether there will be undesired outcomes. She was talking specifically about biotechnological laboratory work in this quote. There is no question as to whether there will be undesired outcomes, as well as, of course, very fine, new vaccines against H1N1 and whatever. My interest, says Piccinini, is in whether we will be able to love them, that is to say, the failures, the undesired outcomes, the genocidal sheep, and the serial environmental, the serial murderer, environmental killers of the Asian water buffalo in Australia, and other critters you'll hear more about before we're through tonight. And then Herbert Dreyfus is a philosopher that many people in the Bay Area will recognize, a Heideggerian interpreter of Heidegger. He explains Heidegger's concept eregness, and he says that means things coming into themselves by belonging together. I'm interested in that in terms of what I'm calling the xenoecologies of home, the making kin and making kind among the strangers. Then Anat Singh, my colleague, an anthropologist who has studied particularly in Indonesia and South Kalimantan, whose current project is tracking the Mitsutake mushroom worlds and the Hmong mushroom collectors and the Vietnam veteran mushroom collectors in the Pacific Northwest and the Japanese and the Russian and the U.S. Northwestern and the many worlds of legal and illegal Mitsutake mushroom trade. Anna Tsing rewrites Engel's marriage, private property, family, and the state from the point of view of mushroom companion species. She has a kind of a big way of seeing the world. And since I have a J.D. Purnell Prize, which is, of course, a prize named after a really important communist, I have great stakes in these rewritings of Engels from the point of view of mushrooms. And she's very serious, actually. It's a much better job than, Engels and Marx both were probably more friendly to multi-species perspectives than most who have followed them in the socialist and communist traditions until really very recently. Nonetheless, they didn't, I think, fully understand the importance of the fungi. Anna says that human nature is an interspecies relationship. Very simple point. That if one is to take seriously species being, this relentless kind of monomaniacal philosophical task that Western philosophers have given themselves, one must think these matters through, not just other concepts, but in a serious multi-species historical manner, that history is not an exclusively human affair, quite the opposite. It is unthinkable as well as unlivable outside the multi-species cat's cradle games that I will try to tell us something about in the course of tonight. Now, I say that companion species, my way to avoid posthumanism and all of its kin, companion species cum panis, that companion species break bread together at table, that it's in the word itself, cum panis, with bread. Who is on the menu at this table is a question of ethical and ecological urgency. It is also not a new question, even in the future tense. In another context, as I said before, anthropologist Marilyn Strathern asked if a contemporary Papua New Guinea young woman who was enmeshed in the complexities of a non-chosen life cycle payment marriage agreement that she wanted out of, nonetheless asked whether she might be able to fulfill her obligations when she was released from the marriage contract by the Port Moresby Papua New Guinea National Court. The question of how to live responsive to inherited obligations was not answered by the release from the marriage agreement. What those obligations had become was literally on the table for all of the unexpected companions who had somehow, in that awful and rather scary Australian idiom, to get on together. In the same years, the Australian artist Piccinini, who makes these life-size alien protectors for endangered species, asked what it would take in technoculture to love the failures, to take care of all the progeny of future besotted biotechnologies proliferating womb labs. Also in my web of companion species, the anthropologist and advocate in Aboriginal land claims, Deborah Bird Rose, inhabits the camp drafts and rodeos of contemporary Australia's Northern Territory to ask how the species in play, the horses, the cattle, the Ural Australian and Aboriginal cowboys of all the available genders and more, might be engaged in a practice of recuperation called taking care of country and bequeathing to those who come after worlds that bear the marks of the care of generations, even in the face of the frontier-making practices of conquest and colonization, of which the rodeo is one very interesting product. With Rose, I want to ask for animal studies and for critters what it might mean to face those who come before so as to leave quieter, less wild country to those who come after. In other words, what might it mean to inherit the past thickly in the present so as to age the future? So in the next few minutes, I'll be at table or cum panis with Strathern, Piccinini, Tsing, Rose, and others in order to work through ontological, ethical, and ecological knots tying together three gatherings of companion species who compel me these days. First of all, the people and the other critters of the Navajo Sheep Project, who bring together the Iberian Churro sheep into many an unexpected world of alliance and conflict, where the premise of human exceptionalism gives way to the dangerous but promising open of companion species. Then I will go to Kakadu National Park on the northern edge of Australia with the Asian water buffalo, and the park managers, both Aboriginal and Anglo-Australian, ecologists and tourist experts, the Binij and Mungay Aboriginal traditional owners of the land, and of course, the Asian water buffalo, who are always feral, never indigenous, always the first immigrants from East Timor into Australia. And then I will take us into the vast growing world of urban chickens and their people in 21st century cities, from Cairo and Gaborone and Santa Cruz and San Francisco and London, the amazing transspecies urban theory that I think undoes other creatures of empire who I want to live with. Now, I've already referred very briefly to a particular way of thinking about time that Deborah Bird Rose gives me. Let me summarize it before I head for the Navajo Sheep Project. We're used to living in Western-related cultures in a kind of sequential palindromic time. There are many sorts of temporalities in this weird thing that gets called the West. But I think we could say that the sort of most naturalized, intuitive, black boxed, ready to hand is past, present, future. And the notion that the present is a vanishing point, is a pivot or a point rather than itself a thickness, that the past, which is never accessible, is always being transmuted in an instantaneous and always vanishing point, a kind of mathematical point, into a future which is never yet here and is always to come. And that in its various Christian versions or Judeo-Christian colonizing versions of the Hebrew texts, that the past prefigures the future and that the present is the time of the announcing of good news or bad news, the time of either coming salvation or coming apocalypse, but all that is important is either prefigured or to come, that the present itself doesn't have the kind of thickness except when one hits the major heresies, including, of course, in Auerbach's version, the major heresies that are given to us by the practices of narrative realism, by Dante in the first instance, by the way that the flesh of the world becomes so compelling that the kind of salvation history and the collecting up of the past into the future through the always vanishing present no longer quite occupies the lived time of the flesh. But nonetheless, I think we could safely say that in the Western saturated temporalities, the vanishing of the present, the irreality of the present, the time you can never take seriously, is always a problem. Well, Rose proposes to us, through her teachers from the Northern Territory, a set of temporalities to think Western temporalities with, a kind of switch of the concepts through which you use to think other concepts with. She says, look, a proper adult among the traditional owners of the land, among the many various Aboriginal groups, of which there are many hundreds of different language groups and hardly all the same, nonetheless, there tends to be a widely shared, at least from the areas of the Northern Territory that she is most schooled in, a widely shared way of thinking about what counts as being a responsible person in temporalities, in time. The job of a full responsible adult is to face those who come before rather than to face the future. That there's a serious switch of the direction of attention. That the job of a proper adult is to face those who come before so as to live thickly in a present which is about 100 years. The present is roughly the time of narratable memory with named people. Okay? There's a sense in which people turn into ancestors in this really interesting sort of movement into the time, into dreaming time, that the enactments of dreaming in the thick present and the narrations of the present and the living out of what it is to be responsible to those who come before is so as to bequeath to those who come after, literally behind, something which might be called quiet country as opposed to wilderness. The kind of encounter of colonial Australia with the traditional owners of the land is built into this whole way of talking. So that the wild, from the point of view of Deborah Bird Rose's teacher, is that country which no longer bears the mark of the care of generations. It's eroded, depleted, depopulated, living in the time of exterminations, or living in the time that Rose calls double death, the killing of generations, not just the killing of individuals, whether it be in hunting or war or other practices, but the killing of the very possibility of ongoingness is the wilderness. Okay? And quiet country is that kind of country that lives with, that inhabits living and dying, so as to bequeath country that bears the mark of the care of generations. So to live accountably is to leave the marks of care for those who come after. She proposes that way of thinking time for the practices of recuperation in the blasted territories of conquest that we all inhabit. She argues for recuperation, not restoration, nor reconciliation, but rather some kind of mixed cat's cradle recuperation that will reestablish the marks of care, that will recuperate the practice of marking with care. Okay? So that's the kinds of ethics with which I want to proceed. And I begin, although we're well into this, so we're far from the beginning. Okay? I go now to the Navajo Sheep Project. I go to the areas of New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, areas of Nevada. I go to the territory of, that was inhabited by the Athabascan-speaking peoples, differentiated on the one hand into the Navajo and on the other hand into the Apache. And I go into the areas that became the sheep cultures of both the Hispano and Pueblo and Navajo weaving cultures out of the adoption of the Spanish Churro sheep. Now, the Spanish introduced a coarse-fibered, long-haired, non-fine wool sheep in the 16th century. There were 2 or 3 major introductions of the Churro sheep, which means coarse in Spanish, and became known as the Churro sheep. If you now Google Churro sheep, by the way, you'll get into the heritage breeds in the rare breeds associations and the genetic conservation practices and the rest. In any case, you can Google Churro sheep, and you will be thrown into some very interesting rare breed heritage practices. But for now, I want to take us back to the late 16th century and the introduction of the Churro sheep for food and fiber animals in the practice of forced missionization, as well as a sheep that would sustain the early Spanish land grant practices, the early Spanish inhabitings of the land, and the impressing of native peoples into coerced sheep ranching in the missions. The fundamental transformation of the ecologies of the Spanish territories and in the mission territories that come up into California, well, certainly including San Francisco, rode the backs of the sheep culture. Now, these sheep were, both through raiding and trade, taken up by the Athabascan-speaking peoples who were never included in the Spanish mission practice and its sheep-oriented modes of containment of the California Indians and of other native peoples. Okay. By the 1840s, the sheep economies of California were in serious decline that had happened with the disestablishment of the missions. But with the gold rush, right, and the need to feed a whole lot of disappointed, hungry miners, right, the West fills up with shipments of sheep that are trekked across from Kansas and other areas to the east, that were shipped up around the Horn, that were shipped into California from Australia, that are marched up from New Mexico. California refills with both sheep and cattle, very much as a consequence of, as an ecological consequence of the food requirements of the gold rush, and then the final consolidation of the Rocky Mountain territories and the West Coast in the post-Civil War areas that permanently changed the composition of microorganisms, plants and animals that sustained the possibility of ranching, that sustained the extractive ranching economies of the West. The Spanish churro sheep was an important early part of this. Now, from a very early part of the history of California, the churro sheep is regarded by Anglos as a kind of scrub sheep, trash sheep, sheep appropriate to the trashy Catholic Spanish, sheep not capable of proper Protestant progress, sheep not worthy to inherit the territories of the United States conquest of the Californios land, sheep that should be suppressed and exterminated. The dirty, long-haired, coarse-haired churro sheep is replaced by the Merino breeds and the Rambouillet sheep and the other imported sheeps of both British and French and Spanish fine wool breeds that become the major part of the sheep economy that most of us know anything about, insofar as most of us know anything at all about the sheep economies that ground our possibility of being in this room. Okay. Now, the U.S. Army was particularly unhappy with both the Apache and Navajo peoples who, among other things, equipped themselves with Spanish horses early on and were highly mobile at warfare, highly mobile raiders and traders, seriously in the Apache end of things into cattle culture, and on the Navajo end of things into a horse and sheep complex, and also peach orchards and really interesting kinds of farming practices across Diné Bata, the Navajo, the traditional Navajo lands. So that the U.S. Army in the pacification of the Navajo conducted one of the first major exterminations of churro sheep in 1863, when Kit Carson chopped down all the peach orchards, killed all the livestock, and marched the Navajo who could be caught to Bosque Redondo for 4 years in the Long March that establishes the memory of contemporary Navajo peoples in relation to conquest. They were released back to the Navajo reservation, but without the traditional seasonal pasturages with the sheep that would move sheep even up into Big Sheep Mountain in Colorado in the summer for summer pasturage. The seasonal movements of flocks became impossible in the reservation system, and the Navajo were forced to accept so-called improved European breeds, though they did, in fact, reestablish their churro flocks, which provided the preferred fibers for Navajo weaving and also Pueblo and Hispano weaving, and reestablished large flocks of churro sheep, even while they also kept the soft wool, Merino, and Rambouillet and other breeds, to the point that in the 1930s and 40s, the second great extermination was practiced, this time by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that does forced stock reductions to deal with the heavy overgrazing of the forced reservation pasture lands. Okay. So that the U.S. Army experts, agriculture experts, and their military accompaniers move from hogan to hogan and shoot every churro sheep they could see and produce the second great extermination, reducing flocks to maybe a few hundred. It's something like the Great Buffalo exterminations, only the practice of mass death was in the interest this time of progressive, modern capitalist agriculture and the effort to instantiate those practices among people who would always be on the bottom end of systems of capital extraction. So the second great extermination is in the 1930s and 40s. So I show you one of the boneyards, a picture taken around 1995 of the exterminated churro sheep. And the individual sheep in 1995 could still be narrated by Navajo elders. Actual individual named sheep could still be narrated in these great boneyards. But I'm not telling a story of extermination in this lecture. I'm telling a story of bequeathing to those who come behind, who come after, the possibility of a more quiet country from the wilderness of the boneyard. I'm telling a possibility, actually. Now I'm sort of leaping decades and many other things. I'm leaping to the late 1970s to the period of the development of the Navajo Sheep Project. Okay? This, by the way, is a Churro Ram in the Navajo Sheep Project. These guys have 4 horns, which I think is quite amazing. Sometimes they have 6 or 8 horns. Yeah, they're like chrysanthemums with these, really, in Chinese, screen painting. I mean, they just elaborate the floral heads. Domestic critters are fabulous in terms of what their genomes get away with. Anyhow, that's another lecture. In 1977, a guy at Cal State San Luis Obispo, an agricultural scientist, named Lyle McNeil, this is funny, an agricultural scientist at Cal State San Luis Obispo, finds himself at a sheep and wool fair, not a particularly unusual thing for an agricultural scientist to do, and finds himself in front of a pile of churro wool and churro sheep, and gets extremely interested in what had become these very rare, very hardy sheep who can live on really lousy pasturage, who have a very low fat content, whose ewes are able to raise twins in most seasons and sometimes triplets on the kinds of dryland pasturage that you would find in Diné Bata in the Navajo and Hispanic lands and Pueblo lands surrounding those areas. Sheep with a long fiber and not the heavy grease and curled and tight wool of the soft wool breeds. Sheep, in short, of potentially very high value, but no market value, and almost disappearing. Well, Lyle McNeil bonds himself with various Navajo weavers and Navajo sheep people. He also bonds himself with, look at this guy, bonds himself with a ranch right outside of Hollywood run by Buster Nagel, who invites, great white hunters, safari people who will pay to come shoot a four-horned ram in a great heroic act of Teddy Roosevelt-esque hunting with the gun as well as the camera. The ranch that Buster Nagel ran, provided rams for the fireplace. He gives Lyle McNeil a couple of rams and 4 ewes. He travels around the Navajo reservation among the very traditional, very poor people in the real corners of the reservation who had somehow avoided being progressive, easy to do in Navajo, many areas of the Navajo reservation, and collects up, with the cooperation of Navajo people, a breeding stock, and begins in collaboration also with the Fort Collins Genetics Laboratory, in combination with the women of Black Mesa, the Women in Resistance, who are trying to deal with the incredible conditions of coal mining in native land on one of the sacred mountains of the Navajo. He deals with the American Minor Breeds Conservancy and the American Livestock Breeds Conservancy. He and they form a kind of very interesting multi-species, multi-people, multi-expertise alliance to restore a breed of sheep to the land. That includes also restoring pasturage so that the reestablishment of the seasonal migrations of the sheep to their summer pasturage ends up reducing what had become blasted wild land, that is to say land deprived of its herbivores, including its conquest herbivores, such that scrub oak had taken over a mixed woodland grassland area on the Big Sheep Mountain, also known as Mount Hesperus. The restoring of seasonal pasturages, the building up of of wool markets, the increasing the price of the wool on the sheep markets. If you Google, by the way, if you're in, some people in this room are probably fiber artists or know people who are fiber artists, and know people who actually know something about the different sorts of wool that you can get if you're serious about spinning and weaving, and the still too low price of churro wool, but the importance of getting a kind of market value here. Also, there has been a kosher sheep jerky with churro sheep affair, churro sheep dairying practices, cooperation with the Kellogg Foundation and the United Kingdom World Congress of Colored Sheep, Yeah, right. You guys are going to get into shape before we're through here. Okay. What I'm talking about is the kind of getting on together, the kind of interrupting one's framework for what constitutes viable markets, ecologies, politics, belonging and not belonging on the land, that work through taking the sheep seriously as players. The behavioral and affective and emotional relationships of these sheep with their people, also the practices of killing these sheep. That is not the practice of the killing of generations. It's not the double death of extermination, nor is it the making them into museum specimens that can only exist as rescued heritage creatures. These are not rescued so as to show the illicit relationships of human beings and other animals getting on together on the land, which is always a question of living and dying and killing and eating, I would suggest. It is, in short, not a rights practice. I think there's plenty of room in our world for the rights practices in relationship to the other organisms, particularly in the face of the mass industrial death and the terms of that mass industrial death that affects approximately 99% of the animal protein that people in this room, any of us who still eat animal protein, have easiest and cheapest access to. Okay? The Romans understood that cheap food was a major imperial policy. Well, so too, I assure you, does neoliberal capital understand that cheap food, including both the symbolic and factual long shadow of animal agriculture, the cheapening of meat, for the improving and ever wealthier neoliberal capitalist populations is, as we all know, a major global disaster. And it's a global disaster at the level of the well-being of other critters. So I assure you, I am not one to trash animal rights movements in relationship to a great deal of this. But what I am proposing is a kind of staying with the trouble that I think something like the Navajo Sheep Project insists that I respond to, that I inherit, that this kid who fantasized being spirited out of a Catholic school on a pinto bareback horse has got to learn to inherit kosher churro sheep jerky, as well as other things. These are contemporary Navajo women preparing churro sheep wool. These are some of the critters involved in the Navajo Sheep Project. You see lamb. This is really a terrible picture that I pulled off the internet, for which I apologize. But what I wanted to show you was that the organism responsible for the safety of the sheep on the land is the llama. The European livestock guardian dogs, Great Pyrenees in particular, had been put with the Navajo Sheep Project flocks in the 1980s, and they did a pretty good job. Any of you who have followed some of my stories in When Species Meet and elsewhere of the slightly mad, purebred dogland Great Pyrenees ladies who placed their dogs with the sheep, well, anyway, I'm not going there. The livestock guardian dog scene didn't work too well with the Navajo sheep, but llamas turned out to be, as they have in many areas of the Rocky Mountain West and other ranching territories, excellent guardian animals who do a really good job with coyotes but are having a hard time with wolves. In any case, the llamas also bond with the sheep, as do the livestock guardian dogs do. They bond both with the sheep and people and work very well in keeping the predators away from their charges. So that we have multi-species labor forces here in a non-metaphorical sense. I think the multi-species labor for me, as a kind of seriously heretical Marxist, is not a metaphor. What it means to think serious labor history outside human exceptionalism seems to me a project that Marx would have liked, even if some of my colleagues get dyspepsia. Okay. They're coming around slowly, very slowly. Okay, I don't have a lot of time, but I really do want to take us to Kakadu National Park with the Asian water buffalo. I confess that I was drawn to the Asian water buffalo initially when I read that they were the first immigrants from East Timor into Australia, because anybody alive today understands that Australia like the United States, is a major place of contestation over immigration from South and Southeast Asia. And that the whole world of Australia in relationship to South and Southeast Asia, having begun in many ways with the arrival of the domesticated Asian water buffalo as a draft animal in the 1820s, in precisely the move that sends the former penal colony the Anglo-Australian settlers over the mountains and into the so-called outback. The establishment of Australia as an export-oriented pastoral economy of the kind that shows up in Sarah Franklin's amazing Dolly Mixtures book, where she tracks through Australia and UK connections the assisted reproductive technologies, the cloning technologies, the whole history of gynecological reproductive medicine. I tell you, sheep and their people are everywhere in this story. The movement, the reconstruction of the vast territories of Australia and Queensland, the Northern Territory, and over the mountains and into the vast interior of Australia, is a story of creatures of empire. And the domesticated Asian water buffalo were draft animals in that project. They pulled the wagons. I love it that the East Timorese pulled the wagons. So they are draft animals in some ways like the Spanish churro sheep. They become part of the practice of the impressing of many Aboriginal peoples as labor force in Anglo-Australian ranching practices, sheep and cattle both. Okay? So that those Aboriginals, 10%, as you probably know, 90% of Aboriginals were killed in the conquest, either from disease or direct murder, but about 10% of Aboriginals survived in many language groups and are very much not gone, thank you, and very much alive in Australian politics. The so-called traditional owners of the land are a serious force and have this notion of it matters which concepts you use to think other concepts with, that kind of having reached into each other, redoing the very concepts of belonging and getting on, that time that is to come. The Aboriginal actors are very much players, in many ways more so than has been true in the United States native politics, although, never mind, that's another story. Well, the Asian water buffalo in the 1820s is a draft animal, part of the impressing of Australian workers into outback ranch station workers. They are then officially listed as stock in Australian census and economic reports. By 1938, interestingly, they're listed as a protected species. They feralized very quickly. By the 1950s, they're listed as an invasive feral pest, and one of the first major exterminations of several 100,000 Asian water buffalo takes place. And by the 1980 to 90 period and following, they are, among other things, trophy hunters for safaris on, they're trophy animals for trophy hunters on safari ranches, and highly contested species between traditional owners of the land and biodiversity ecological restoration people. And that's where I will take up my story in Kakadu National Park. Now, one of the things you should understand about Asian water buffalo is that they get on very well without people, which is one of the things that made sheep and goats and pigs so amazingly powerful as changers of the ecology of the West. Think of the Spanish who leave their larder animals on islands, their goats and sheep, for example, which to this day are major forces in the trouble of ground nesting birds or any kind of ecological restoration projects in the southern islands and off of California. People in this room probably know a fair amount about the ongoing trouble of the feral pigs in California. The relationships of the feral pigs and the mountain lions, and then relationships of those with suburban edge ecology people. We are seriously good social opportunists, we animals who have done this together, and we all love edge ecologies. We all live in each other's edges. the wolves who have recolonized in Minnesota and many other places. They have these vast interior territories where they could be just fine, thank you, but they really like what goes on at the edges of highways. Ecotones are extremely productive ecological areas. There's a tremendous amount of wealth produced in edge ecologies. And there's a whole lot of multi-species, social, opportunistic making a living on these edge ecologies. And Asian water buffalo turned out to be very good at it, thank you. They fertilized in Australia and made use of the altered ecologies and went about altering them on their own, including stamping out just about anybody who wants to live in the wetlands who was already there, amphibians, birds, so on and so forth, a major ecological disaster in the wetter areas of northern Australia. They are people in this room probably know how hated feral pigs are by true-believing biodiversity, biological, ecological restoration folks. You can't seriously love feral pigs without finding yourself in real trouble with the most committed ecologists among us, with the most committed restoration ecologists. They are serious destroyers of the land, particularly when there aren't enough predators around. Asian water buffalo did the same thing in Australia. Furthermore, they had the unmitigated chutzpah to become reservoirs of both brucellosis and tuberculosis, which the cattle ranchers cannot abide. This is, of course, true, if you can imagine such a thing, of the elk in Yellowstone and elsewhere, and the buffalo. And one of the big problems with buffalo restoration in Wyoming has to do with the terror that the cattle ranchers have of the microsymbionts, the disease organisms that the buffalo are perfectly capable of carrying into the cattle, as are the elk. My mother-in-law's car, she died, and her car was donated to the Buffalo Field Campaign in Montana, and it's now herding buffalo back into Yellowstone, who would otherwise be killed by overeager ranchers. Never mind. Back to the Asian water buffalo. Kakadu National Park. How many people in this room have been to Kakadu? It's a World Heritage Site. It's a natural and cultural World Heritage Site. It's a major, 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 major place. It has two major visitor centers at different entrances to the park that I will tell you something about. It is recognized not just as a World Heritage Site, but as an Aboriginal place, though when it was so designated by law, it was also designated with a mandatory lease back to the federal Australian government. So it is owned by a consortium of about 13 different language groups who have residents in the park. Actually, there are probably 150 groups who have residents in the park, but 13 of them are from groups who are traditional owners of the land, and they work through government and work out how to get on together in the land where the Asian water buffalo remains a particularly interesting species. Because unlike most inheritors of the traditions of white settler colonialism and its ecologies, the introduced species, including ourselves, are always bad. Okay? There is an extraordinary practice of disavowal of the creatures of empire, including ourselves, in the political and fantasy practices of inheritors of white settler colonies, whether they're white or not. The actual color white is not so much the point as that inheriting of the notion of belonging and not belonging, and that disavowal is almost the only way you can keep belonging. And one of the ways you practice disavowal and belonging is to exterminate the feral pigs, or the Asian water buffalo, or the pampas grass, or the others who really don't belong. Even if it happens, as in the case of Australia, that the Asian water buffalo, through the rodeos, the camp drafts, the stock practices, the stock families, became quite integrated with family stories, with labor histories, with practices of belonging, and are considered, if not exactly part of the dreaming, they're not, On the other hand, they turn up in rainbow serpent stories, they turn up in family stories. Feral is not equivalent to pest in the languages and the practices of people in question, but rather how various kinds of species can and cannot get on together, and who should and should not be killed or lived with. This is not about never killing Asian water buffalo, but it is about holding fast against extermination and holding fast for their belonging in a World Heritage Natural History Park, where the biodiversity experts seriously want them out. Okay? So that Asian water buffalo exists, but only under what Elizabeth Povinelli would call the categories that come from the cunning of recognition, the categories of the traditional, or of subsistence food, or that which the Aboriginals can do as they enact their culture in view of the tourist public, or the enacting of a past which can't really be about the time to come. The Asian water buffalo have a kind of a grudging permission in the park from the point of view of the biodiversity experts, but a belongingness from the point of view, a managed belongingness from the point of view of the association of the 13 traditional owners of the land. Now, this different way of thinking about inhabiting the land is enacted in the two visitor sites. The visitor site you would enter from the northern part of Kakadu National Park will provide a biodiversity and scientific story of the great wonder of Kakadu and a traditional owners of the land account of the great wonders of the 50,000-year richness of Aboriginal inhabitation. But both of them are outside history. Science is outside history by virtue of somehow once a certain kind of scientific knowledge is established through practices, which everyone recognizes, it somehow precipitates insolubly outside of time and becomes simply that which is the case about the world. The way that science is presented to the public, or indeed even by scientists to themselves in some of their less careful moments, is outside of time, that there is a way in which everything that one does is inside time, but that which is acquired becomes a view onto a scene and is somehow precipitates outside of time. Similarly, that which is traditional or that which is Aboriginal or primitive or original or myth, that which is religion and not science, or myth and not history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know all these binaries. Two ways of being outside the time of the thick present. The other visitor site, which you approach from the other end of the park, actually brings the visitors through a series of seasonal movements through a calendar that is about the enacting of the land. As you move through the land, you enact it through a seasonal calendar, so that the tourists and others who move through the visitor site encounter those who must somehow be, those with whom one must get on together in the enacting of responsibility for those who came before, which is an extremely interesting way of not exiting time and staying with the trouble, I would suggest. What can I say? I'm not going to say anything. The continued trophy hunting of captive critters with, really fancy phallic objects is an international pastime. It's highly gendered, but I assure you the girls do it too. And indeed, in Primate Visions, you will find a picture of Delia Akeley standing atop her elephant kill with a... So I'm going to do it just by telling you that feminist political ecology and feminist geography has done a trip on the rural-urban contrast. Binaries have fallen in many hands, and I'm sure some of the boys have done this one too. But reminding us that the history of cities is a trans-species affair, then and now, and reminding us, as Diane Rochelot did with trees in West Africa, and in Alice Havorka did it with chickens in Botswana, reminding us that the multidimensional inhabitings of space with critters is the name of wealth and is the name of making a living. That you can't talk about capital, you can't talk about land, you can't talk about labor without having a multi-species affair. In case you've forgotten that contemporary cities are multi-species affairs, remember Cairo and the so-called swine flu in the early part of 2009, when the Egyptian government decided to placate some of its more Islamist groups with the extermination of the pigs, which are taken care of by Christian Egyptians in the suburbs of Cairo. And the pigs, who are both a food animal and a companion species to the Coptic Christian, Egyptian Christian communities, also in the major garbage collection in all of Cairo. Okay? So that the pigs are exterminated in a so-called public health measure that has now created a giant garbage crisis throughout all of Cairo. Okay. Which is, of course, one of the great worries about the accumulating garbage is disease, which they well earned. Except that, of course, the Christians are much poorer without their pigs. So we have a serious crisis of a mass extermination event in 2009 surrounding Egyptian pigs and the Christian and Muslim communities of Cairo. The pigs of Gaborone, Botswana, in the year 2000, there were about 200,000 people in Gaborone and about 2 million chickens. This is hardly unusual. And the Tswana Chickens foraging in Gaborone are in that picture. But of course, the mass industrial chicken system as a way of modernizing is also instantiated in Botswana, so that you will find the Kentucky Fried Children and chicken plants throughout Africa as an effort to create dependent capital formation. Missoula, Montana has passed a chicken ordinance in 2008. American Gothic is really a wonderful form. This is a Montana family of a multi-species sort. This is a Montana citizen in 2008. Okay. And this is a conference in Milwaukee in 2008 that is a multi-class, multi-race, multi-species alliance for food and justice, the Urban Agricultural Conference in 2008 in Milwaukee. Some of the workshops: immigrant farmers in the city, urban agriculture and low-income communities, growing food and justice, designing sustainable cities, the urban livestock movement, and so on and so on and so on. It's a major happening. Also, there's a movement in London to attempt to feed the 2012 Olympics from food grown entirely in London. Urban agricultural feed the Olympics. It may not succeed, but it may. Okay, well, do we laugh? Beatrice DaCosta is a history of consciousness graduate student and a well-known artist and a tenured professor at UC Irvine, who did the Pigeon Blog project that is truly my ending, the rats of the city, the pigeons. The pigeons in 19th century London working class formation, by the way, that Darwin wrote about, the Spitalfield pigeons, the fancy pigeons of the silk weavers of Spitalfields, the weavers who resisted the machine weaving practices that their less privileged weaving brothers and sisters were unable to resist for as long as they did. The pigeon fanciers that Darwin hung out with were the pigeons of the Spitalfield silk weavers. Meanwhile, the working classes of British cities, right up into the 20th century, the dovecots and the rest are really leveled in the early 20th century, when the great improving agricultural movements of capitalist agriculture made cattle available to the aristocracy and the wealthy classes. Pigeons became available to working class and peasant populations. They had previously been forbidden. Pigeons become the food of the working class in the kind of dregs of improving agriculture, and they move with the working classes into the cities, so that the backyards of urban working class housing in throughout England are full of dovecots, where the rock pigeons are a major food source in a food-impoverished working class community. This is still true, for example, in the Hmong populations of Fresno, California, not pigeons now, but chickens, large areas of Fresno, California are recreated Hmong villages so that the old CIA collaborators of the Hmong who moved to California, as well as lots of other Hmong people who were displaced to California, have recreated these extraordinary urban agriculture in Fresno, up to the minute thank you. This is not some residue of the past. These are the cities that are happening. These are the getting on togethers of staying with the trouble. Well, Beatrice does the Pigeon Blog Project with collaborators of hers who are racing pigeon fanciers in Southern California. My God, eugenicists, they must be Nazis. You know, they breed purebred chickens. How dare they? They keep genetic records. You know, they can tell you the ancestors of their pigeons when they don't know their own. You know, they raise their sons to kiss pigeons as a form of masculine adolescent identity formation. I'm not kidding you. This is a boy thing. Pigeon love is definitely a boy thing in Southern California. I don't know. These are interesting practices. Well, Beatrice hangs out with the pigeon fanciers. She hangs out with city-based activists around toxic pollution so that you can get real-time air pollution monitoring at the levels at which people breathe and pigeons fly, so that you can get real-time feedback, so that pigeons can be fitted with these really clever little miniaturized packages. So she works with these little IT designers and these little, miniaturization freaks, which is not altogether a boy thing. Fascination with the miniature. Girls with doll houses really ought to run the IT industry. Anyway, Beatrice worries whether the packages are too heavy, and they measure the drag on the pigeons, because as you also probably know, the endangered raptors hang out in cities because there are all these really neat places for raptors to hang out and strike pigeons. So that one of the things she was worried about was these packs would put too much drag on the flight of the pigeons, and the hawks would move in and eat their research collaborators. Or they would be exhausted and die of heart failure when they returned to the pigeon fanciers. Okay, the point being that they were fabulous collaborations between anti-toxic activists, engineers, pigeon fanciers, artists, all the rest. Beatrice also was gifted with a nasty letter from PETA to the UC Irvine administration about why these experiments are allowed to continue in the blah, 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 blah. Anyway, she too has been the object of PETA, but lest we hate PETA, it is, near as I can tell, the only serious activist on the spot these days who is pointing out that chickens throughout North America, the Europeans are doing better on this, are still killed in some of the most painful, brutal ways possible, even though a perfectly good gas atmosphere killing system that doesn't involve human handling is available. And since we evolved in an oxygen, carbon dioxide environment, all of us, including chickens, have these really amazing carbon dioxide sensors. So when carbon dioxide levels go up too high, we really get uncomfortable because it's really important to get the hell out of there and get back to more oxygen. But we don't have good argon sensors. So you can fill the atmosphere with argon and die without knowing it. Now, there's only one chicken processor in this country that does controlled atmosphere killing at all, near as I can tell, from having tracked it, even though PETA has been really blowing the horn on this for a few years and doing a great job on it, thank you. Go Google and watch the outrage footage, which is unhappily true, that PETA puts out. The vast brutal murder, it's a kind of it's kind of political pornography that does some interesting work. Chickens killed with argon don't suffer. Chickens killed with carbon dioxide do suffer. It's cheaper to use carbon dioxide than argon-nitrogen mixtures. And pretty much all the processors refuse to use either because it would take retooling. The European Union has mandated retooling so that you have minimum human handling. Anyway, that's the industrial chicken. So I end with the Pigeon Blog Project and staying with the trouble. Thank you.